Welcome back, everybody. Before 2020, the colonial history of the Biodiversity Heritage Library collection was not considered an active part of today's biodiversity knowledge sphere. We are now examining the heritage collections of the BHL with a different lens. Authors of the legacy literature of biodiversity often furnished biased perspectives of the world. At best, their views were products of their times and incomplete. At worst, the legacy of natural sciences is unjust and inhumane. As we reflect on our shortcomings and analyze the knowledge gaps in our collection, we're looking for ways we can fulfill our responsibility to identify the missing perspectives and people in the science of biodiversity and shine a light on them. It's my pleasure to introduce Lydia Ponce de la Vega as our closing keynote speaker. Lydia will share insights from her research on the decolonization of biodiversity knowledge about Latin America and recommendations about specific actions BHL can take to increase representation within our collection, audiences, and services. Lydia Ponce de la Vega is a doctoral candidate in Hispanic Studies at McGill University. She holds an Honors Bachelor of Arts Gabino Barreda Medal in Hispanic Literature and Language from the National Autonomous University of Mexico, and a Master of Arts in Hispanic Studies from McGill University. She has worked as a research assistant in paleographic and modernized editions of colonial texts at the National Autonomous University of Mexico and is currently a digital humanities course lecturer at McGill. Her research interests lie at the intersection of Latin American studies, eco-criticism, and digital humanities, especially regarding the epistemic decolonization of Latin American nature and biodiversity in digital archives. Thank you for joining us today, Lydia, to discuss decolonizing strategies for an equitable biodiversity heritage library.
Thank you so much, Connie, for that lovely presentation. And thank you as well to everyone at the BHL for inviting me to speak today. And thank you to all attendees for being here. So before I start with my presentation, since I'm currently studying and working at McGill University in Montreal, Canada, I would like to read the following territory acknowledgement. McGill University is located on unceded land, which has long served as a site of meeting and exchange amongst Indigenous peoples, including the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe nations. McGill honors, recognizes, and respects these nations as the traditional stewards of the lands and waters on which we meet today. The recognition of Indigenous and natural histories as tied to coloniality could not be more relevant as they are today for our conversations in the framework of BHL Day 2021, as was already addressed in Ian's presentation earlier today, and in particular for my presentation, which I have titled Decolonizing Strategies for an Equitable Biodiversity Heritage Library. This reminds us that the history of biodiversity runs in parallel with the history of human societies, and the intertwining paths of humanity and biodiversity are documented in a long history of human texts. With the increasing importance of digital archives, these paths are compiled, accessed, and disseminated through digital means, as exemplified by the Biodiversity Heritage Library. However, as the BHL has consolidated as an outstanding effort to document the global literature of biodiversity, it intertwines inevitably with processes of epistemic colonization. Therefore, it is essential to acknowledge and counteract these biases and colonial dynamics that underlie the construction of biodiverse knowledge. For starters, it is imperative to highlight the human-non-human relationships that biodiversity entails, as well as to critically explore the impact of digital technologies on systems of knowledge and power that determine how we study biodiversity. By evidencing human constructions of and approaches to non-human subjects, we can better understand not only the importance of biodiversity knowledge, but its shortcomings, as well as how it affects our understandings of different regions in the world. To counteract environmental and human crises, we must aim for a plural perspective that comprehends and transforms all our relationships with nature and human minorities. Dipesh Chakrabarty, in his reflections about climate change, asks, and I quote, "How do we relate to a universal history of life, to universal thought, that is, while retaining what is of obvious value in our post-colonial suspicion of the universal?" End of quote. A new narrative of history brings together diverse human and non-human stories across human and non-human specificities. What we can do for more equitable inter and interspecies relationships is to reframe our positionalities with, in, and as biodiversity. We must go back to reread and rewrite the general history of life of which Chakrabarty speaks, without losing sight of human history and the colonial processes that have determined it. This must be an essential objective in the decolonization of biodiversity collections in the BHL, in its questioning of our historical, digital, and archival understandings of humanity and biodiversity. The histories, that is, the narratives of humans and non-humans, as well as the epistemic discourses and practices that determine them, must be reframed so that our relationships with and within biodiversity become more just. Here I follow Donna Haraway's view of symbiosis, a term proposed by Beth Dempster that Haraway defines as the practice of, and I quote, making with, worlding with, in company, in complex, dynamic, responsive, situated historical systems, end of quote. The existence and understandings of human worlds thus depend on the existence and understandings of other worlds. Human worlds do not exist in themselves or in isolation. They are part of a network of worlds that intertwine and share their existences, worlds that constitute symbiotic systems. What we call the world, made up of a multiplicity of worlds, is the result of these intertwining histories. Humanity, or better, a multiplicity of humanities, is located and enacted from and within such histories. Diverse human subjects, experiences, and knowledges are situated within that multiplicity of worlds and are part of the histories of biodiversity across spaces and times, as I try to represent in this visual of a symbiotic model. While humans interpret non-human histories through constructed scientific and epistemic paradigms of space, time, and being, these symbiotic histories do not reflect nor respond to those paradigms. They exist in a manner and on a right of their own. A symbiotic concept of biodiversity unfolds a story that is in turn made of human and non-human stories alike. These are precisely the histories of biodiversity that we must strive to retell through archives. The BHL is in a privileged position to aid the process of reassessing our historical and present relationships within biodiversity and within plural humanities. The goal must be to turn traditional historical accounts into an attestation of the symbiotic stories and potentialities that biodiversity archives present, a necessary ethical review in pursuit of a decolonized, decolonizing, equitable, and symbiotic future. For the BHL, it is fundamental to consider the role of technology in the pursuit of this goal. With an increasing advancement of digital media, inter and interspecies relationships are now more than ever enacted through virtuality. In the case of our relationships within biodiversity, virtuality enables the manifestation of such relationships, which in no way questions the reality. I have a way of establishing a physical relationship with a Carcharodon carcharias, known as a white shark. It will always be mediated through images and texts, which I access through technology. However, such virtuality does not interfere with the actual affects I build through my virtual relationship with the shark, nor with the commitment I make to establishing a symbiotic relationship with my non-human kin that includes the sharks and my human histories. These are precisely the narratives that the BHL promotes, advances, and curates. Here is where technology, archives, and biodiversity meet. And herein lies the mission of the BHL: to advocate for equitable intra and interspecies relationships that originate through digital knowledge but impact non-digital worlds. In the BHL's promotion of a symbiotic and decolonial virtual approach to histories of biodiversity, a fundamental consideration must be that of multicultural representation. By implementing important networking strategies, the BHL has adhered to a global approach with a catalog characterized by a multiplicity of genres, topics, disciplines, and audiences. On the one hand, this multiplicity aligns with the ideal of symbiosis through the incorporation of diverse and plural humanities and biodiversity and diverse modes of narrating their histories. On the other, it highlights the need to contend the colonial dynamics around its catalog and archival standards. This decolonial move, in its pursuit of multiplicity and plurality, requires that globality intertwines with locality, creating a global community that nonetheless emphasizes the local, as was also mentioned in Jane's presentation earlier. This importance of decolonial locality for the BHL is clearly exemplified by its notes in the Global South, such as BHL Africa, BHL Cielo, the note for Brazil, and my main focus of analysis, BHL Mexico. BHL Mexico is the result of a partnership between the BHL and Mexico's Comisión Nacional para el Conocimiento y Uso de la Biodiversidad, CONABIO. Tied to the BHL's efforts towards multiplicity, the CONABIO-BHL partnership is an opportunity to share Mexican plural knowledges with global audiences, a means to ensure the digital preservation and dissemination of Mexican biodiversity-related collections, and a channel for the epistemic exchange between the Global South and North. According to Tapia Tinajero and Guzman Vera, one of BHL Mexico's objectives was to increase the number of materials about Mexico available in the BHL. They mentioned that before the establishment of BHL Mexico, the BHL included 600 texts about Mexico, of which only 44 were written in Spanish. The remainder, written in other languages, were produced outside of Mexico. That is, texts in which Mexican biodiversity was the object of study, but Mexico was not the site of production of that knowledge. On the contrary, the vast majority of BHL Mexico's texts now incorporated into the BHL collections are written and published in Mexico and belong to the collection Publicaciones en Español. Thus, through this partnership, CONABIO has reached out to global audiences, and the BHL has opened spaces for the incorporation of plural knowledges and plural sites of knowledge production, taking a step beyond the traditional colonial epistemic hierarchy between the Global South and North. Nevertheless, the BHL's collections are still heavily dominated by English and centered in the Global North. Materials in the BHL catalog are mostly in English, even for projects such as BHL China, BHL Africa, and BHL Singapore. As of June 2020, more than 90% of the texts in BHL China and Singapore, and more than 80% of the BHL Africa collection were in English, as shown in these graphs. In contrast, BHL Mexico and BHL Cielo favor their country's imperial languages, Spanish and Portuguese, with 84% of BHL Cielo's collection in Portuguese and more than 99% of BHL Mexico's in Spanish. What these numbers suggest is that while languages other than English are present in its collections, there is still a long way to go if the BHL desires to become a truly global and plural library. Further moving towards the establishment of a multilingual platform should be an objective of all decolonial archives. In this regard, it is important to note that Spanish and Portuguese are imperial European languages, and that there are almost no materials in the BHL in non-hegemonic languages. Worth highlighting in all 5 collections is the absence of materials in indigenous languages, despite the cultural indigenous richness of these regions and countries. In Mexico, this absence is even more relevant considering that the Estrategia Nacional sobre Biodiversidad de México y Plan de Acción 2016-2030 establishes as one of its main goals the inclusion and revalorization of indigenous biodiverse knowledge and sustainable practices, a goal that CONABIO has consistently pursued. Thus, the BHL's affiliated collections highlight a need to focus on such revalorization, not only from the local, but also towards the global. Here again, locality becomes a central mission for the BHL's global nodes. It is fundamental for BHL Mexico to move away from imperial linguistic representation and towards the inclusion of non-hegemonic languages. In this sense, Conavio is in a privileged position to advocate for the incorporation of Indigenous knowledges, materials, and languages in the BHL. Albeit the absence of Indigenous languages, in the case of BHL Mexico, incorporating and highlighting the importance of other languages, even if hegemonic and imperial as is Spanish, is a valuable move away from the digital hegemony of English and an opening to non-Anglophone communities. Furthermore, growing the selection of texts in Spanish in the BHL is a step forward in providing access to Indigenous communities. According to UNICEF, out of at least 522 identified Indigenous peoples in Latin America, 99 have lost their language and speak either Spanish or Portuguese. Additionally, most Latin American Indigenous peoples are bilingual, speakers of an Indigenous language plus Spanish or Portuguese, with the number of monolinguals of these two growing every year. Thus, increasing the online presence of materials in Spanish and Portuguese, albeit imperial languages, could potentially mean increased access for certain Indigenous communities. The situation is, however, much more nuanced, not only because of the digital divide, but also since a considerable number of Indigenous languages in Latin America are disappearing because of Spanish privilege. This is a complex panorama for the BHL. While increasing the online presence of Spanish is a move away from Anglophone digital neo-imperialism, it is simultaneously a contribution to the consolidation of Spanish as the language of progress in Latin America. The decision-making process is not an easy task, but these are issues that need to be addressed, especially in online epistemic practices. Ideally, a site of knowledge production such as the BHL includes all languages, starting with those that have historically been most oppressed, such as Indigenous languages. This is a task to be shared amongst partners in their local practices. Nevertheless, making space for materials in languages other than English in the BHL is a decolonizing first move that can contribute to the deconstruction of epistemic hierarchies and advance the creation of a multilingual biodiversity library that bit by bit, meaning both piece by piece and binary digit by binary digit, might lead to plural and diverse inclusiveness. Along with diverse language representation, it is essential to consider the geopolitics of access to the BHL from a global standpoint. Comparative web analytic data from SimilarWeb on traffic shares by country from April to June 2020 to the BHL and to Conavio's biodiversity website, as they appear on the slide, show Mexico at the top of the list, not surprisingly, with the highest number of visits to Conavio. What is interesting, though, is that the BHL has a considerably low traffic share from Mexico compared to Conavio, but significantly higher numbers in other countries, especially outside of Latin America. The US, Germany, France, Australia, and the UK show percentages of traffic share to the BHL of between 92 and 99%. On the other hand, Latin American countries show an opposite pattern of access, as Conavio has a traffic share of 72% from Colombia and 68.8% from Peru. In contrast, Brazil is the only Latin American country where almost all traffic goes to the BHL, and in fact, has the highest share of traffic to the BHL of all countries in the top 10 at 99%. Given that Brazil is also the only listed Latin American country where Spanish is not the most spoken language, traffic shares could be influenced by the website's main languages and the availability of materials in Spanish. According to 2019 data from the Instituto Cervantes in Spain that I have compiled in this table, 5 of the 6 countries with the largest number of Spanish speakers in the world made the top 10 list of access to the BHL and Conavio: Mexico, Colombia, Spain, the US, and Peru. These numbers, like the case of Brazil, continue to evidence the importance of language diversity for digital archives such as the BHL, emphasizing the relevance of projects such as BHL Mexico. Since the availability of texts in Spanish is a great asset for Mexican websites such as Conavio's, including them in the BHL can make room for the participation of more Latin American communities in the library. In turn, audiences from Europe and the US can access local Mexican knowledges through the BHL, moving towards more global audiences for Mexican epistemologies. Nonetheless, the arguments about the value of language are not necessarily true for all countries. While Spain and the US show access to both websites and are amongst the countries with the largest number of Spanish speakers in the world, they still register a greater traffic share to the BHL at 72.2% and 92% respectively. This is meaningful as it moves beyond language and into the sphere of knowledge production. The cases of Brazil, the US, and Spain emphasize the need for a strategy that simultaneously considers plural linguistic and geographical representation and widens networks of online biodiverse knowledges beyond the constraints of hegemonic languages and geocultural barriers. Multilingualism and diverse linguistic representation are but the first steps of what should be a deeper restructuring of the networks of biodiverse knowledge that transcends the hierarchical dichotomy between the global South and North. In this regard, it is notable that the data show no presence of Asian and African countries in access to the BHL and Conavio, which suggests a minimal to non-existent cross-global South interaction. A symbiotic archive would require a stronger decentralization of knowledge production through greater collaboration and engagement with and between countries outside of Europe and the US. The BHL could then function as a point of contact between them, especially considering its existing global nodes, as well as the library's plans to expand their partnerships to other countries. Promoting a collaboration not only directly with the BHL, but amongst its global nodes would be a further step into opening a truly global and decolonial dialogue around multiple biodiverse epistemologies, as well as engendering greater and more plural engagement. A key aspect to promote the involvement of and networking amongst diverse communities within these epistemologies is related to social media platforms. The BHL offers its partners the opportunity to nominate content to be featured on the BHL's social media accounts, including in their yearly social media hashtag campaigns. This promotes the visibility of BHL partners, but also of marginalized knowledge production. In 2019, the hashtag campaign, #HernAturalHistory, sought to highlight the contributions of women to global natural history with the purpose of counterbalancing the underrepresentation of women's work in the sciences. Particularly relevant from a symbiotic perspective, this hashtag exemplifies the connection between human and non-human histories of oppression, embodied by non-human species at the object of study of natural history and the epistemologies advanced and developed by women. Additionally, some of the posts utilizing this hashtag emphasize the work of racialized women and the importance of intersectionality within the sciences, further linking this initiative to plurality and diversity. Despite the campaign's favorable numbers, positive outcome, and plural and biodiverse background, it is important to highlight that the involvement and participation of BHL Mexico and affiliated organizations was considerably low. There was only one contribution directly tied to BHL Mexico, a blog post by Mónica Aguilar Rocha on the life and work of Dr. Elia Bravo Ollis. I quote, "the first certified biologist of Mexico," end quote. Aguilar Rocha's text highlights the contributions of Dr. Bravo Ollis to Mexican history and biology, emphasizing the relevance of her work as a female scientist, and was published in the BHL blog and featured on the library's official accounts on Twitter and Facebook, as you can see on the slide. This post holds great value in representing biodiverse intersectional female epistemologies produced in Mexico and made available globally through the BHL, an exceptional example of decolonial and symbiotic practice. Nonetheless, what is striking is the lack of more content developed in and focused on not only Mexico, but other places outside the Anglophone global North. Despite its biodiverse outlook, the BHL's Her Natural History campaign shows low numbers in terms of contributions from the global South. Given that the BHL's catalog still privileges English as the hegemonic language of biodiversity-related knowledge, the possibilities of featuring posts outside of these parameters on social media are hindered too. Thus, greater diversity in archival collections can lead to a more equitable representation of communities and biodiverse knowledges on social media. The shortcomings in the diversification and plurality of the BHL's social media activity are further evidenced when considering other layers of meaning. For instance, the majority of posts related to the Her Natural History campaign presented knowledge produced in the Anglophone Global North and that refers to non-human species in the Global North as well, blurring both Global South plural humanities and biodiversity. The remaining works shared were mostly examples in which the knowledge production was taking place in the Global North, but had as its focus the biodiversity of the Global South, further fostering the dichotomy North subject versus South object. Such is the case of a post shared by the BHL on Instagram featuring the work of Lina Lois. The case of Lois is a particularly rich example of the intertwining of historical narratives of human and non-human subjects. The BHL's Instagram post that I am showing here featured Lois's illustration of Pirostegia venusta, known as orange trumpet vine or flame vine, from her work Familiar Indian Flowers. The post also explains that Pirostegia venusta is a plant that, and I quote, was originally endemic to Brazil, but has now been cultivated in gardens around the world, end of quote. However, in Familiar Indian Flowers, Lois mentions that this plant, and I quote, is a native of India, end of quote. Lina Lois was an Indian-born British illustrator. Her work, Familiar Indian Flowers, was published in 1878, and a digitized version of it was contributed to the BHL by the University of Illinois. However, according to the BHL catalog and the International Plant Names Index, the earliest recorded mention of this species is found in the Botanical Register by Sydenham Edwards and James Ridgway, published in 1817, contributed to the BHL by the Missouri Botanical Garden Peter H. Raven Library. Edwards and Ridgway mention that the several species under the genus Bignonia, to which Pirostegia venusta belongs, are, and I quote, indigenous in South America, end of quote, noting that this species was introduced from Brazil to London around the time of publication of their register and was becoming popular amongst the London population. Therefore, it is possible that flame vines were later introduced to India through British settlers, and by the time Lois published her work, were popularized and normalized in both countries, with their origins blurred, as evidenced by Lois's affirmation of its supposed Indian origin. In this case, the network of biodiverse histories around Pirostegia venusta, from the origin and colonial-based travels of the species, to the authors that study and illustrate it, to the holding institutions that share their work, to the BHL itself that disseminates it, points to the narrative plurality of sympoiesis, which can serve as a point of departure towards decolonial archival practices. While the BHL's Instagram post highlights the Brazilian origin of Pirostegia venusta, the narrative complexity of its histories could be further emphasized, not just as part of the library's social media activity, but also regarding the metadata included in its catalog records of both Lois's and Edwards and Ridgway's works, which I am showing here. Other than author, year and place of publication, and holding institutions, metadata in the BHL catalog for these books include unequally long lists of subjects. Since the BHL collects this metadata from collaborating institutions and partners, the differences in terms of detailed subjects can be explained by the local parameters of each holding institution, as well as some of the challenges that Jacqueline addressed earlier today. However, even if unintentionally, these differences communicate an unequal valorization of the work of female and male authors and of topics pertaining to the Global South and North. For example, while the record of Edwards and Ridgway's work strongly emphasizes its pictorial nature, Lois's rich illustrations are not highlighted in the metadata. Additionally, the metadata of both records erase the importance of South America as the starting point of the narratives around Pirostegia venusta. The geographical affiliations of these texts are limited to the authors, British, place of publication, London, holding institutions in the US, and subjects, India and England, respectively. None of these affiliations includes liaisons with South America, and the knowledge production linked to authors, publications, and holding institutions is located exclusively in the global north, while India, the only geographical affiliation located in the global south, is but a subject, that is, an object of study. I recognize that these works are catalogs of different species whose origins can be traced around the world, and that metadata must be faithful to the information of each text, meaning that colonial geographical affiliations and authorship cannot be erased. Nevertheless, what these records are missing is contextualization. Decolonial archival practices require a critical approach and reform to metadata and curatorial standards. Incorporating metadata parameters that make room for diverse contextualization, for instance, to note that the described species in these books are of diverse global origins and often tied to colonial expansion and colonial scientific development, can promote a more inclusive and plural approach to archival practices. Specifying standards for metadata categories can promote a more equitable representation of marginalized groups. If contextualized, this network of biodiverse plural histories can be communicated across local and global communities from a strong decolonial and poetic stance, both in the BHL's catalog and social media activity. While the task of contextualizing the thousands of records present in the library can be overwhelming, contextualization is an essential step in the decolonization of digital archives and archival practices. In this regard, the BHL's establishment of global partnerships with countries such as Mexico should contemplate the availability of and sharing of materials, but also move towards a true collaboration in the construction of a more inclusive archive, metadata, and networks of biodiverse knowledges, that is, of a symbiotic system in which the narratives and epistemologies of plural humanities and biodiversity can be fairly represented. All in all, a networking and collaborative strategy for archival practices and social media that is rooted in the reformation of curatorial and metadata standards can aid the BHL and its global partners in consolidating the library not as a repository of knowledge, but as a network of biodiverse plural knowledges. To conclude, the BHL is on the right path to become an equitable, decolonial, and global biodiversity library, but faces important challenges that need to be addressed. My suggested goals and strategies for the BHL towards decolonization, in no particular order, include to question historical and archival understandings of humanity and biodiversity, to reassess historical and present relationships within biodiversity and plural humanities, to advocate for equitable intra and interspecies relationships, to expand multilingual interfaces and collections, to diversify global partnerships and promote cross-global South collaboration, focus on the equitable inclusion of Indigenous knowledges and languages, to promote the participation and visibility of diverse communities in contextualizing collections, and to diversify metadata through diverse communities' involvement. All of this with particular attention to the Global South as a site of biodiversity-related knowledge production. I strongly believe that BHL has a unique opportunity to decolonize its collections, particularly concerning interspecies relationships, that is, our knowledges and experiences with, in, and within biodiversity. Acknowledging and contending colonial biases in knowledges of biodiversity are fundamental steps towards equitable, sustainable, and fair biodiverse coexistence. Thank you. Gracias.
Greetings, everyone. My name is Bianca Crowley, and I am the Digital Collections Manager for the Biodiversity Heritage Library. I'd like to start off by thanking Lydia very much for her talk and use the next 20 minutes or so for some Q&A. And please be mindful of using the Q&A feature to ask your questions. I also just want to make sure that you all understand that any questions that are submitted that we don't have time to cover today, we will record them and certainly consider them as part of our future discussions. Our collections committee is really in the throes of undertaking a lot of these discussions right now. So I'm very much looking forward to this. So first and foremost, Lydia, I'd like to start off with a question from our program director, Martin Kalfatovic. He would like to know, is there a bibliography of non-hegemonic or indigenous biodiversity texts?
Yes, that's a very good question. To my knowledge, there isn't, especially not one with a global approach. That means including indigenous knowledges from different parts of the world. So that's part of it too, right? Because we look at the history of knowledge production, and these are knowledges that have been consistently marginalized. And a lot of them are also transmitted through oral means. So there's no written record of a lot of these knowledges. So in that sense, it might be necessary to take a different approach in promoting the participation of indigenous peoples in suggesting materials or suggesting avenues to incorporate their knowledges into archives and collections such as the BHL.
Thank you. The next question I have is from Mary Oviedo. Other than multilingual representation and metadata, are there any other strategies that the BHL could consider to promote more engagement amongst Latin American users?
Yes, thank you. I actually didn't have time to talk about everything that I've been looking at, but another thing that is really important, for example, has to do with mobile networks. So Latin America is a region where the use of mobile devices has been growing exponentially in the last years, especially with the pandemic now. There's an increased use of mobile devices. And if we look at web analytic data, for example, we can see that when we look at access to, for example, BHL and the Conabio website, there is a more or less 50-50% of access through desktop devices. But when we look at access through mobile networks, we see that Conabio has 3 times more access from mobile devices than the BHL. So, for example, a strategy that contemplates the importance of mobile networks and devices in regions such as Latin America would also be an important strategy for the BHL. For example, in having a mobile-friendly website, having an app, for example, and considering other forms of engagement that might also open avenues for mobile access. That would be very important in the case of a region such as Latin America.
Thank you. I'd like to follow up with a question from BHL's side. So I really appreciate you articulating various goals and strategies clearly for the BHL. As an organization with very few dedicated resources, we really need to prioritize 1 or 2 areas of focus for the near term. What do you think is the most important goal to work towards over the next year?
I would say focusing on the representation and inclusion of indigenous knowledges and languages. I think that should be one of the priorities. And probably contextualizing metadata, at least texts that have this strong colonial background and history. Those 2, I think, would be the main priorities.
Thank you. I also have a question it's actually a series of questions from Cecily Rayner. She's asking about, and this question might also be for some of us in BHL too, but what are some of the challenges for working across such a multilingual corpora? And how can we pay homage to the multiple nuances of language difference? Certainly, even within Spanish, there are so many nuances, country to country and region by region. How do we account for the dearth of indigenous languages? And how might these absences provide insight for researchers?
Those are great questions and very important ones too. I would say one very big challenge that I have faced myself with my research has to do with the technology itself, with the tools we have, because they themselves are all built around English.
Mhm.
As I was mentioning in my presentation, English is the digital hegemonic language, and even code is based on the English language. So, and if you look at texts, for example, I run some text mining analysis that require text-based versions of the materials in the BHL. If you look at OCR versions, English texts usually have a cleaner version versus other languages that have a lot of issues. For example, in the case of French and Spanish with accents, that usually does not translate very well when you are working with digitized and text-based versions of these texts. So the technology itself, because it has this affiliation to English, is one big challenge that I think we continue to face as we're working with these texts. And I think in that sense, that will probably, of course, exceed what the scope of the BHL is, but there is also this need to rethink tools themselves and to probably push for the development of tools that are based on this multilingual approach, which I know there's a lot of people that are working on that, and that's something that needs to be taken into consideration. And then there's questions about the absences, right? So the absences are also very important to address in these collections. And I think it goes back to the idea of networking, of opening participation, of reaching to communities outside, again, of that kind of Anglophone sphere. That could definitely be another way to incorporate, especially if we're talking about Indigenous scholars, or people who can contribute to that multilingual, multicultural approach to the collections, and identify those absences that perhaps we, in a different kind of positionality, not always are very aware of. So I think that there needs to be a networking kind of dialogue around these presences and absences and what they communicate as well.
Thank you. Okay, a couple other questions here that are coming in. Wanted to ask this one on behalf of Matthew Person, who works for the McGill Hui Library, one of our BHL partners. He's asking, your points about the metadata related to specimens and literature are well understood. Records have never been represented as the product of the work or of a particular cataloger at a particular institution at a particular time. Contextualizing this information would be certainly a valuable task, but it may take international expertise and participation, and perhaps a whole new tool to build an alternate and more fair record for this work. And I guess this was more of a comment, really, but I think this question or this topic is something that a lot of libraries are really thinking about right now, is how can we revisit a lot of this, I remember from library school, very foundational work in cataloging that doesn't even consider this sort of contextualization approach. So yeah, I certainly wonder how could we as BHL help the library community with that contextualization process?
Right, that's certainly one big challenge because we're looking also at a different kind of level, right? It's not just the individual library that is facing this, but this comes also from other standards and parameters that have been used for a long time and by different institutions. And then you also need to respect interoperability. And so there are a lot of issues that come with that. But and I think Matthew is very right to know that this also needs that kind of re-understanding of tools. Even if we don't have the tools to do it, then that's an added challenge for sure. So I do think that it is a very kind of complex task to undertake, but again, in incorporating the participation of people with different backgrounds that can notice this shortcomings, that can start the dialogue, and even just starting the dialogue itself, rethinking metadata, perhaps adding certain categories to metadata, things that might not necessarily mean a full restructuring of the approaches and standards of metadata, but even just taking this first small steps before we think into the larger scope of it might be like the initial contributions to that kind of restructuring that is of course very much needed, but often exceeds the possibilities in terms of workforce, in terms of budget, in terms of time, and so on. So I think maybe starting smaller or trying to focus on opening collaboration, diversifying collaboration, for example, or opening certain categories of metadata are possible first steps to be taken in that direction.
Thank you. I also have a question here from Catherine Bundy. She's asking, do you see any advantage to incorporating mapping technology for expanding metadata that is assigned to archives that traces qualities like origin, migration, and mythical and physical ties to different locations?
Yes, I mean, I see the advantage and I see the value to visualize, to map geographical affiliations, especially because I do consider that contending geopolitical and geocultural barriers should be another goal of decolonizing archives, especially in digital spaces that lend themselves to this kind of dialogue. But again, I think this would be a strategy or a change to undertake later on, as it would require another set of tools, again, another thing of another way of restructuring the entire understanding of how we present metadata. So I would say I do see a big advantage to that, but I don't see it as happening too soon, as it would require a lot of more restructuring prior to be able to actually put that into place.
Thank you. We might have time for maybe 2 more questions. So I wanted to turn now to something actually that I was wondering. I'm the collections manager, and as part of our collections discussions, we've really talked a lot about the importance of providing access to materials with sensitivity to the harmful content contained in our collection, but without censorship. And one of the things that I'm particularly thinking a lot about these days is how can we help our users more critically assess materials for biases and colonial epistemological approaches?
Right. This is actually a very good question, because I do believe too that we should not censor materials, that if we are also thinking about the goals of open access, which I think are very valuable, especially for a library such as the BHL, we definitely should avoid that kind of censorship in general. But then, yes, of course, it's kind of finding the balance between the two is very challenging. I totally agree. I would say I know of a couple of projects, other archives and digital projects that have opened a kind of like a parallel project to have metadata that is annotated by people who are directly tied to the culture being represented in those texts, so that they are providing and kind of going back to what Ian was saying in the morning, to this listening to their stories, right? So opening that space for those cultures, for those communities, individuals to share their own stories, and see that vis-a-vis the story that is being told by the material, by the problematic or or sensitive material that is being presented, and kind of have the two sides. And that way you are not censoring the original material, but you're also opening the space for the other stories to be also told in a kind of parallel way as the material that you're sharing. So I know that's one strategy, for example, that has been put into place in other archives, and again goes back right to the idea of networking and diverse participation.
Great, thank you. I do have one more question that I hope we can squeeze in before we close for the day. This is from Grady Lovelace. Oh wait, maybe it's not actually a question, but he's recommending biocultural and traditional knowledge notices for Indigenous designed educational digital labels to convey permission, protocols for broader Indigenous data sovereignty. So localcontext.org is the group, part of the Global Indigenous Data Alliance. So that's a great recommendation. Thank you. We'll certainly look into that. Is that something familiar to you as well, Lydia?
Yes, I've actually seen the use of TK labels in different archives. I think having that specifically biocultural approach to TK labels might be especially relevant for the BHL.
Thank you. Okay, and I think what we'll need to do now is turn it back over to our speaker for closing. Thank you so much again, Lydia.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you so much to all of our presenters, as well as our audience, for the contributions to this 2021 BHL Day. I want to thank Ian Owens for his insights on the biodiversity crisis. I'm especially pleased that he was able to present some positive insights and to talk about differences in culture and other ways that we can improve biodiversity, the care of biodiversity. I also want to thank all of our consortium partners for sharing the lessons learned while facing the COVID-19 crisis. I got a lot of really interesting information from that, especially about management, thinking about how I was in the same situation trying to manage a library that was completely closed. And it was great to hear how many others have been thinking about this deeply and how similar some of our approaches were and all the different approaches, which I found fascinating. Also to Lydia for her guidance in ways we may begin to address our collection's colonial past. It was really helpful to hear some clear ideas for how we can approach this in BHL. And whether by presenting ideas, asking questions, or listening attentively, you have all helped extend our global network as part of our 2021 BH annual meeting. I also want to note that I think the approach that BHL has, our global approach, our ability to reflect on our collections and reflect on how best we can serve our users, the networking, and most importantly, I think the key to BHL success is the community and the way we have been able to cross all of the divides that are there and make a community that has been able to share during this COVID time ways to work, important information, and keep the BHL going. It's all a key to BHL's success. So the events of 2020 have challenged us to reflect, research, and rethink our role as an open access digital library and consider the ways that we can acknowledge where our collection services and program fail with regards to diversity, equity, and inclusion, but also ways in which we can help. We can now better articulate our role in combating racism in natural history collections and diversifying collections and services, and also just in general, try to contribute to the improvement of knowledge and maybe cultural change in the world. This is our first public step into this journey of looking at combating racism, and we look forward to engaging with our network over the course of the next year and beyond. We'll review all the questions that have been submitted, even those we did not have a chance to ask publicly, and consider their application within our current and any future working groups that we may form. As we look forward to implementing the goals of our new strategic plan, we will continue to reflect on what actions BHL can take to challenge the heritage of scientific advancement at the expense of colonial conquest and make progress towards equity in the natural sciences. As a reminder, we'll be making all of the recordings of these sessions available soon via our BHL Day 2021 event page. And we want to thank you so much for joining us today. And until next time.